This is the Science Communication Toolbox for Researchers, and it's funded by NSERC, and we're very pleased that you can join us. I'll start off with a quick little introduction and overview of the workshop series, and then we'll start with Public Engagement 101. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we gather to be the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. This is a series of workshops provided to people across Canada, and there are people joining us from other parts of the world. And I would encourage you to have a little look using these two resources, Whose Land and Native Land, to find out about the Indigenous people who live and occupy those lands. And so you can find out a bit more about where you are. Public Engagement 101 is the third workshop in a series of 7 workshops for the Science Communication Toolbox for researchers. We've had Science Communication 101 and Social Media 101 so far, and today is our third workshop, Public Engagement. What we're going to be covering in this workshop. First of all, I'm going to go over the principles of public engagement and how it differs from other forms of science communication. I'll talk a little bit about why public engagement matters, and what you'll get out of it. And then we'll have a look at types of public engagement, and I'll give you some case study examples. And I'll talk about opportunities that you might have for engaging online and carrying out effective public engagement. And as a lot of us are currently working from home and primarily doing a lot of our work and communications online, hopefully this will be very useful for you. And it's going to be led by me, Tristan McLean. I'm the Knowledge Mobilization and Communications Coordinator for PermafrostNet. First of all, what is public engagement? Public engagement is a term that is widely used in a variety of sectors, from arts, heritage, to science policy and local government. In some sectors it has a very precise definition, and in other areas it's used much more flexibly. There are a variety of terms that have been used to describe the public and their interactions and knowledge of science. Public understanding of science is a term that used to be used a lot, and more recently, in the past 20 years or so, public engagement with science and technology has been used more regularly and more frequently to provide a broader description of how the public might want to have input and understand what's going on in science and research fields. In the UK, that's sometimes termed as public engagement with research, and it's more broad than just the scientific or technology fields, and it can incorporate social sciences and other parts of academia that conduct research. In the USA, public engagement with science is commonly used as a term, and there are also other related fields and terms. People will talk about science and society as a broad term that covers a variety of issues that impact people and the way that science interacts with our larger society. So, for example, the University of Ottawa has the Institute for Science, Society and Policy, and they have obviously a more policy-focused approach to things like the governance of science and technology and how innovations and emerging technologies may want to be either regulated or managed in the academic circles. As we're going to see throughout this presentation, there are a variety of different terms that are used. The National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement is a UK organisation, and really they sum it up in the fact that public engagement differs from other science communication in that it is a two-way process. So there is interaction, there's listening, and a goal of mutual benefit between both parties, both the the scientist or researcher party and the public or the audiences that you're engaging with. I'm going to provide a number of little definitions because they do vary in different organizations. As you'll see, the terminology that's used in Canada can be quite different. So the American Association for the Advancement of Science, they describe public engagement as intentional, meaningful interactions that provide opportunities for mutual learning. So as much as you may be providing knowledge and information to the public about science, there's also the opportunity for you to learn from members of the public and for them to inform your work. Now in Canada, there are different terms. So the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, they tend to use the term knowledge mobilization. And knowledge mobilization has a lot of the same features as public engagement, but it also incorporates what we might think of as science communication and other forms of one-directional knowledge transfer from knowledge generators or producers to knowledge users. The way that they incorporate public engagement within this description of knowledge mobilization is they have reciprocal and complementary flow and uptake of research knowledge between the researchers, knowledge brokers who coordinate the use and transmission of knowledge, and the knowledge users. And this can benefit both parties in positive ways and can have positive impacts. Within academia, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council are looking at how you can engage in a variety of different ways that are maybe slightly different to the way that NSERC would think about it. And NSERC don't tend to have the same specific definitions of knowledge mobilization. But it is incorporated into programs like NSERC PermafrostNet. So NSERC PermafrostNet has a plan for the program for the duration of the network to have a committee to oversee knowledge mobilization as well as communications, and of course myself to coordinate some of those activities. So I would take on that sort of role of knowledge broker and try to enable those activities to happen and to take place. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research have other terms, another slightly different way of looking at it. And it's still, in many ways, quite similar, that it's a two-way sharing of information. Citizen engagement is a term that they use in their work. They also use terms such as integrated knowledge translation, IKT. And the idea for that is to bring together researchers and research users to shape the research process. So it starts at a very early stage where the users collaborate with the researchers to set research questions, decide on methodology, they get involved in the data collection, how data and tools are developed, how the findings are interpreted, and how you then may disseminate those research results. For the Canadian Institute of Health Research, it's just as important to be two-way communication that involves a diverse group of citizens, and those people who are collaborating, working with researchers, are going to be involved in decision-making. They're going to have powers over that and responsibilities for that. There are a variety of mechanisms such as dialogues and deliberations and collaborative activities that can be undertaken to enable this to happen. This is really the sort of the pinnacle where you have knowledge users involved right from the outset, and they're really got a strong voice and a strong involvement in the research that's undertaken. And the medical and health fields have got a very good history of this, and they've got a very well-established processes and procedures, primarily because it often relates to the importance of decisions on people's health and the impacts it can have. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of public engagement to give you a little bit of a perspective of how we got to where we currently are in terms of public engagement and knowledge mobilization. And as you can see here, we have two types of models. They're called the deficit and the dialogue model of public engagement in science communication. And over time, we've moved from a deficit model to a dialogue model. And I'll kind of run you through some of the milestones and the things that have shaped and influenced this change and this evolution in the way we think about science interacting with the public and society as a whole. Back in 1951, or 70 years ago, the American Association for the Advancement of Science revised their goals to increase public understanding and appreciation of society. And as you can see there, they use the term public understanding. And as I mentioned already, this was one of the older terms that was used to talk about the way people understood and thought of and interacted with academia and research and science. And this was just before the big sort of push in America to get a man on the moon and all of the excitement that went along with those big scientific developments at that time that really got people in the US very excited about science and technology. Moving much closer to the present day, in the UK, in 1985, the Royal Society published a report on the public understanding of science. This is often referred to as the Broadway Report. And similarly in this, it was stated that scientists should consider it their duty to communicate to their fellow citizens about their work and its importance. So this really is about communicating one way, passing on your information, telling people about the work you do and the science you do. This is a good start for having that greater conversation with the public, but it is a one-way process. It's a deficit model of communication. This led to a variety of things like the Committee on the Public Understanding of Science, involving the British Association for the Advancement of Science, the Royal Society, and the Royal Institution. One of the things that happened then, shortly after, are some things that may not seem related at first, but had a big impact on the way the public saw science and expertise. And in 1986, it was first identified that there was an infection in cattle in the UK, known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, or more commonly referred to sometimes as mad cow disease. And at the time, scientists and experts said it was unlikely to affect humans. In 1989, we had the Survey of Public Understanding of Science. So the first UK professor of public understanding of science at Imperial College published a survey and found that there was a high level of interest in science in the UK, in British citizens, but only 14% of people would be considered what would be said to be scientifically literate. And this kind of sets up the deficit model. Is the thought that there's a need to fill that lack of science literacy and science knowledge and understanding. So shortly after this, we had newspaper reports that there might be dangers from BSE to humans. At the time, this was played down very much by politicians, and there was no scientific evidence really that this was the case, and people thought it was unlikely. Now, 1994 is a key moment. Certainly in the UK, this was when there was a consensus conference on plant biotechnology. And I'm going to come and discuss this in a case study a little later, but this is one of the milestones. This is the first really dialogue event that was taking place to discuss with the public and with experts what are the impacts and the potential societal changes and policies that we might need if we're going to genetically modify plants. Only 2 years later, the first cases of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease were announced. And Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is the result of consuming material from cows infected with bovine spongiform encephalopathy. And so up until this point, the public had been reassured that there was no risks from BSE and from eating meat from cows that had been infected or that could have been infected. And so at this point, there was a lot of distrust in the UK public about the expertise and about science that had been transferred to them. They've been told to trust in the expertise, and they lost some of this trust. At the same time, same year, Dolly the sheep was cloned near Edinburgh in Scotland at the Roslin Institute. And this was another example of an amazing development in science that people maybe had some reservations about. They felt that it maybe was something they weren't prepared for, something that they had concerns over cloning. And these had major political effects. In 1997, there was a new government in the UK. The previous government, the Conservative government, they lost a lot of seats, and the new Labour government came in, and part of that was due to some of these crises that had happened. In the US, in 1997, the broader impacts were introduced to NSF grant procedures, and this in the US was a major milestone in recognizing that the way that science and research knowledge generated and conducted had to do more than just contribute to the academic circles and the academic knowledge and peer-reviewed papers. So this was quite a big milestone in the US. Now, in 1999, only shortly after the new Labour government in the UK had been established, there were reports that eating genetically modified crops produced through plant biotechnology, might present dangers. And this, of course, was coming shortly after people were aware of the dangers of eating cows in the UK. And this added to the sense that people weren't maybe very comfortable with some of the research that was being conducted. And this was a time in the UK when there was a lot of concern over the direction that research was going. 1999 was also the year that I joined the UK CJD surveillance unit, and it's the same year that Scottish devolution occurred, and Scottish got its first parliament, and this added to the greater development of public participation and democracy and an openness, that there needed to be more decision-making amongst people and in smaller forums. So there was a general societal change going on at this time. In the year 2000, there was a government report from the House of Lords Select Committee on Science and Society. And this was where they advocated a shift from this deficit model, simply giving information, to a wider dialogue model of engaging around science. The National GM debate was then set up in 2003. This was a large debate that reached about 20,000 people. It was run by the UK government, and it was supposed to really get people to be able to have their input and talk about genetically modified crops and plant biotechnology. After this, and around this time, there's a lot of growth. There's new science festivals and developments, and citizen science starts taking off in the UK. In Canada, in 2005, the Ontario Knowledge Transfer and Exchange Community of Practice was established. We're a group of practitioners, researchers, and individuals who were really starting what is now knowledge mobilization field in Canada. One of the really big developments in the UK a few years later was the setting up of the Beacons of Public Engagement in the National Coordinating Centre of Public Engagement. And this was really quite a landmark, because in 2010, they released, along with the funders of research in the UK, which are the Research Councils, the Wellcome Trust, and the Higher Education Funding Council, the Concordat for Engaging the Public with Research. And they wrote up a manifesto for public engagement that would be something that universities could sign up to if they were going to support and embed actual public engagement in their work. And to date, there are 88 universities in the UK that are signatories to the Manifesto for Public Engagement. So this is really a big institutional level change that occurred in the UK. In 2012, here in Canada, the Knowledge Mobilization Forum was founded. And in 2014, the science culture where Canada stands expert panel was put together. So this was 2014, and in Canada at this time, there seems to be a lot of support for science. So science culture is looking really, really good in Canada. 93% of Canadians either moderately or very interested in new scientific discoveries and technological developments. Canada's number 1 out of 33 countries that we looked at in this measure. So at the moment, it certainly seems that at this time, 2014, there's a lot of support in Canada for science. So the public support is there. In Canada, public engagement is primarily driven by the Canadian government. It's a term that is used very broadly, and it may not just relate to science, but there are programs such as the Citizen Science Portal, and there's the Great Lakes Protection Initiative I'll talk about later, which is run by Environment and Climate Change Canada. The Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada engages with Canadians in a variety of ways. So they have external advisory bodies, things like the Advisory Council on Artificial Intelligence. They have the COVID-19 Exposure Notification App Advisory Council that will look at things like privacy and data collection. They have an Industry Strategy Council, and they also conduct a variety of public consultations. There are the research councils, and I've already sort of mentioned their sort of definitions of public engagement, citizen engagement, knowledge mobilization. There are non-profits, so you have organizations like the Alberta Eco Trust Foundation, the Pembina Institute and Evidence for Democracy, social enterprises like Smart Ice that I'll talk about a little bit later, and then you have universities as well. So Memorial University and Newfoundland and Labrador, they have a public engagement framework. Public engagement in practice. First, you need to think about what is the purpose? What's the purpose of your public engagement? And there are many possible reasons you might want to engage the public, such as responding to societal needs. You want to think about the people. Who are you planning to engage with? That should be one of the key factors that you think about when you're trying to choose your methods, who to involve. You want to think about the process. What are the techniques and the forums that you're going to use to be able to reach people and engage with them? And then very importantly, you want to evaluate your actual process and your public engagement to see if it's being effective. The purpose. There are many possible reasons for engaging the public. As I mentioned, you might want to be responding to societal needs or requests, sharing what you do, because you might want to inspire learning. You might want to inspire people to look in science and take more interest. That's often seen in engaging with young people. There's a lot of drive to encourage people to take up STEM careers and show more interest in these as careers, and so that it informs their knowledge as they grow up, and they can make informed decisions on things like vaccines and what they eat, and make those sort of decisions coming from a place of understanding the science behind them. You might want to create knowledge together, collaborative research, and that's something that citizen science is very good at potentially achieving. Or you can have participant involvement in maybe medical or health research in some ways. You might want to apply knowledge so that you can collaboratively come up with new solutions to problems. There may be existing problems and you actually need to work together to look at those. There's an example of that I'll talk about in the case studies a little bit later, looking at diabetes, First Nations. And learning from others. It's amazing how often I've run public engagement or outreach activities, and the scientists taking part in them at the end of the day have learned things or gathered new perspectives or things they wouldn't have thought of by talking to members of the public. And you may also be wanting to change attitudes or behaviors. You may want to encourage people to, in permafrost, maybe manage the snow differently. You may want to have people think about how they move snow and the impact it might have on the permafrost that is around buildings or roads. And so that might be one of those purposes you have for engaging with the community. So once you've identified your purpose, then you should have a little think about why it matters. There's accountability. Institutions and researchers need to be accountable, especially if they've got taxpayer money and public money that their research is dependent on. Increasingly, organizations are required to have values, and you often see that you want to have clear indication that you have established a set of ethical guidelines and you're doing things in a way that's carefully thought out for their implications. So values and purpose are really important for organizations, and public engagement can really help to show the wider societal benefits of your work and to get feedback on that. You might want to be establishing trust. It's very hard to win people's trust, and it can be really easily eroded. Crises like the measles, mumps, and rubella debates on vaccinations have shown that. Issues in the UK of genetically modified crops, and ultimately, of course, climate science. There's a lot of distrust around this. Relevance. You want to show that the work and research you're doing is not just in an ivory tower, that it has direct relevance to the public, that the work you're doing is going to benefit them and is worthwhile. And responsiveness. You want to ensure that you're not just offering what you want to offer in terms of research and as an institution, as a university, in terms of delivering education, but you also want to ensure that you're listening and providing power to the people that you're serving is also a really important part of this. What are the benefits if you go into all of this? You can gain new perspectives, as I mentioned. You might be able to carry out collaborative research. There might be new opportunities, and the societal impacts of your research might change the way you go about it and make you think about your priorities and what you want to research. It enables you to build bridges with communities. So if you're finding that maybe people aren't engaging with, thinking about your work or paying interest in it, by actually carrying out public engagement, you can build those bridges. And hopefully this means that you're going to have more impactful results, that your research is actually going to have a greater impact. Once you've decided on the purpose and you've seen the importance of carrying out public engagement, you really need to think about who it is you're actually going to engage. And this is something that you should really start thinking about at the very, very beginning. And there's a whole variety of different demographics and groups of people that you might want to engage with. And you can break those down in terms of things like their age, their gender, their location, their interests, their ethnicity. And so you might have select groups, select audiences. There may be a local community group, might be a family group. It could be students or underserved audiences, young people, or Black and minority ethnic groups. So once you're clear about the purpose and who you want to engage with, it's worth thinking about what are the sort of techniques, what are the methods that you're going to do for carrying out public engagement. And they can be generally broken down into these 6 sort of categories. They're not completely all-encompassing, and people can be very, very creative about different ways of having conversations, giving people something to think about, and then stimulating discussion and feedback. But generally, you've got public attitude survey, which collect data on ways that people view science and they view research that's undertaken. You have dialogues. They tend to be much more involved discussions where there will be talking between experts and members of the public. They'll have questions. They're usually focused around a certain specific issue. It might be something like synthetic biology. Creative engagement, there's lots of very creative ways. I'll talk a little bit about things like using plays and theatre to engage people in scientific topics, in the case studies. Citizen science can be very, very good for collecting data and also letting people see the processes involved in science and feeling that they're contributing themselves to the outcomes. Participatory research takes that a bit further, and in some cases that may involve people who are not only the ones who are collecting data or analyzing data, but they may be taking part as subjects in the research, or they may be deciding on the direction of the research. And then there's online public engagement, and this takes a variety of forms, but tends to involve discussions with sharing information back and forth. You can think about public engagement on a spectrum, and there's some examples here which are just a few of the ways that you can carry out public engagement, and they're not definite, they're not defined. As you can see, you have citizen science is more engaged, patient co-design is more engaged, and on the other side you have things like podcasts and radio as less engagement, but these are flexible to some degree. For instance, if a radio show has a phone-in, and you have members of the public phoning in and asking questions of the scientists or experts who are on a panel or on an interview, then that would certainly shift that activity over into having more engagement. Similarly, you may have an op-ed or some other article published online, and if there's a comment section and there's a way to have a discussion in conjunction with that article, then you're going to have more engagement. It's more about really that two-way process. The more two-way sharing of information, the more engagement it will be. Now, there are challenges to public engagement. So first of all, it's how do you fund it? How do you have enough money to be able to actually conduct your public engagement? Do you have enough time to do it? What about skills? Do you have the skills? Do you have people you know or you can work with who are going to have the skills to enable you to carry out your public engagement? What about your research topic? This can have quite a big impact. Some research topics are going to be much easier to engage people with in discussions and debates because they're more accessible. For instance, if you are studying the Higgs boson or possibly tectonic plates, it's much harder maybe to engage people with those kinds of research because they're a bit more abstract, they're a bit more complex, they require maybe more study to understand, in comparison to maybe something like water quality. If you're studying water quality and it has a very direct impact on people, on their health and their environment, that might be a topic that it's easier to engage people with. You might also have the attitudes of your peers playing an influence. They may not see this as a worthwhile activity. And likewise, the organization which you're based in may not have the same level of support for public engagement. And that can be a barrier. In some cases, it can be really, really good. They might have a really, really good culture of public engagement. Most of the UK universities now have a really, really good culture, and there will be people there who can support and help you carrying out your activities, planning it, finding funding for it, and those sort of things. Now, there are limits to public engagement. It can't be applied to everything. And this quote from 2004 by Dick Taverny kind of sums up the issues that some people have with this approach to science communication and science and society. Here it's maybe taken to an extreme that you don't decide by referendum whether the Earth goes around the sun. But it does point out that there are some limits to public engagement, and there's some worries that this approach can erode evidence-based decision-making and trust in expertise. And certainly during this current coronavirus pandemic, there has been a tension between advice from experts and public willingness to trust and follow that advice. So there are legitimate concerns, and some people would see public engagement as something of a populist approach to science and research. And these concerns have been around since the early 2000s. A number of organizations were set up to try and ensure that there was going to continue to be good evidence-based policymaking and expertise at the heart of public discussions, such as the Sense About Science and the Science Media Center. And then you have organizations like The Conversation, which was established in Australia and New Zealand in 2011, which provides a means for academics to directly communicate their science online. So you can see that these are limits to public engagement, but I still think it would be really, really valuable, and I would definitely recommend that you think about ways that you can put it into practice. I'm going to have a little look at case studies and provide you some examples of public engagement that might help you think about ways you could work with the public and develop your science communication in a two-way information sharing direction. So what I'd like to start off with is the UK's National Consensus Conference on Plant Biotechnology. This is back in 1994. And I think it's worth mentioning because it is one of the first instances that we know of this type of approach. So it was in collaboration with the Science Museum, and it was carried out by the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council with support from organizations like the John Innes Centre and the Institute of Food Research. And it was a consensus conference about new technologies for modifying and changing the DNA and genetics of plants. A consensus is a forum in which a group of lay people question experts about a controversial scientific or technological subject. So they assess the experts' responses to questions that they pose to them, and they reach a consensus about the topic, and then those results are compiled into a report, and there's a press conference where the outcomes of this discussion and debate are presented. So there can be some decision making in terms of the lay people who are involved in the discussions. This builds on some early experiments and work done in governance in Denmark. The Danish Board of Technology, they created this model where a lay panel would have some volunteers that would meet for a few days, they'd deliberate on an issue, have presentations from expert witnesses, find out a bit about it so that they became informed, they knew about what's going on, and then produce this in something to take away that policymakers can look at and consider. So in this case, in the UK, this involved 2 briefing weekends where the lay people were able to find out about the issue. There were some hands-on activities as well. The scientists showed them how DNA is extracted from plants, so they could see a bit about the process and the actual work that's done. They were using pipettes and the sort of tools that scientists are using in the lab, so they could see exactly how it's done. They came up with 7 questions that they wanted to ask the panel around things like regulations and heritability, and a lot of things that would be societally important, and questions around how plants are modified and what that's going to mean. They had 3 days to discuss this, and the experts went off. Initially there might have been about 80 experts that the panel shortlisted that they wanted to interview. And then they were sort of whittled down to those who were able to actually attend and answer discussions. And the experts went away, and after having listened to the lay people and their questions, to talk about it and then to respond and give answers to those sort of questions as best they could, and then form a report. And the final report was looked at by government and MPs, policymakers, and it had some effects. They were positive that it should still go ahead, that you should still be able to carry out genetic modified crops, you should still be able to produce those, that it was going to be important for alleviating the loss of crops to drought, and it was going to help feed people better, so it was going to reduce waste, and it was going to be generally beneficial for agriculture. But they also had some reservations about modifying animals. They did see that as slightly different. They didn't want to see animal modifications being something taking place in the future. The next case study that I'll provide you is the Bioenergy Dialogue. So the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council have really been leaders in public dialogues and having these types of conversations, like consensus conferences, that involve citizens in decision making, that bring together a diverse mix of citizens to get their views and their values, so they can discuss and they can reflect and come up with ideas about where you move forward on what can be complex and controversial issues. A good example of this is something that I was involved in, was the work around bioenergy that took place in 2012 and 2013. And this involved some public dialogue sessions with researchers and facilitators throughout 2013. They collected feedback forms about what people thought about issues around production of biofuels from crops or from farm waste, or growing certain plants to produce fuel, and the impacts that that would have. About 162 feedback forms were collected, and the organisers of the events also compiled reports. There were about 35 of those that were given back to BBSRC to be combined into reports. And they were supported with outreach events. So there were outreach events to provide a wider discussion and debate between scientists and members of the public at events like the Norwich Science Festival and the Big Bang Fair, which is the UK's biggest science fair, primarily for children and young people. You have school students attend, and there's a day for the public to go along at the weekend. So we developed educational activities, informal science activities, so they could do that. And we also developed some activities that could be used in schools. So the Demox is a discussion activity that teachers could facilitate in their classrooms. Another example of this sort of approach is the Building with Biology program. This is the multi-site public engagement with synthetic biology that was funded by the National Science Foundation in the US. And this involved around about 200 sites in 2016, primarily science museums where there is informal education undertaking. I was involved in development of some of these activities. We worked at the Science Centre in Ithaca in upstate New York, which is a science centre that primarily caters to younger audiences. So elementary children are its main audience, and we would develop activities that enabled them to learn about the science and synthetic biology. And while they're doing those activities and learning about that, it provides an excellent opportunity for the scientists to have more engaged and advanced discussions and conversations with their caregivers. So it might be their parents, it might be teachers, and that's a really, really good way, and it's a very effective way that's often used to enable scientists to work at a number of levels in informal science learning. It can be really, really helpful because people tend to be a lot more relaxed and much more willing to engage when they see scientists trying to produce something for their families, for young people that will inform and educate them, and that they're also willing to have open discussions with parents or adults. In Canada, there is the Sustainable Canada Dialogues, which is a voluntary network of over 80 researchers from every province in Canada. There's 20 research chairs, 16 directors, and 7 members of the Royal Society of Canada. It's been operating since 2014, and it engages in what's called synthesis research to support evidence-based decision-making. So it has its own process of collective decision-making, consensus building, where scholars will layer comments over each other, and these will be finally incorporated into reports, and they will collect feedback from external stakeholders to inform those, to bolster the relevance, to make it more relevant, and to make it more legitimate. As I've mentioned in the previous workshops, Science Communication 101, there's the Alberta Narratives Project. This is a fantastic, very, very rich, deep public engagement series of dialogues. There was 55 narrative workshops, and there's 75 organizations involved. So a lot of people were able to get together and sit down and talk around climate change. So this was a community-based initiative. It was run by the Alberta Ecotrust Foundation and Pembina Institute, and it was organized by social scientists and communication specialists working with researchers. And they spoke with a very broad variety of people: farmers, oil sands workers, business people, youth, environmental activists, faith leaders, lots and lots of different demographics, utility operators. They really covered a very, very broad spectrum of people, got lots of different ideas and views on climate change, and were able to combine all of this into some great reports to really, really helpful for talking around climate change and what the public think and feel about these things. This is the supporters of the Alberta Narratives Project. And as you can see, this is a big project. This is the sort of project that requires a lot of stakeholders, funding and support. And it's more than one researcher or one small group can undertake. As you can see here, the University of Alberta were involved, the University of Calgary were involved, foundations like the Calgary Foundation, and big organizations like Telespark or Suncor. So it's a big undertaking, and it's the sort of thing that you might be involved with, but definitely need a lot of support for that sort of thing. Now, I'd like to talk about some creative forms of public engagement. So in 2010, I was involved in a play, Blooming Snapdragons. It was a play about the history of women in science and genetics, and it was held at a theatre in Norwich, at the Royal Institution. And after the play, there was a Q&A session with researchers who were involved in plant genetic research, contemporary researchers, and there was also a chance to talk with the actresses about what they'd learned about science and the history of women in science, putting together the play as they created it and worked on the script. So it was commissioned by the John Innes Centre as part of the centenary celebrations of the John Innes Centre. And it's a really good example of how theatre can be used to get people to think and engage with science when maybe they normally wouldn't. And so having a Q&A afterwards provides that means of that two-way communication back and forth. Another project that was really exciting that I was involved in Edinburgh was a immersive experiential theatre show. It's probably one of the most exciting public engagement events I've been involved in. And it was held in Edinburgh, and there was organizations like the Roslin Institute, where Dolly the sheep was cloned, and the Wellcome Trust Centre for Cell Biology, and there was neuroscientists from Edinburgh University involved. And it was a theatre production. It was a fully immersive experience where people came in and they were almost instantly exposed to what we may be a little used to now, those sort of temperature checks and people with face coverings, as you can see here in this picture, to protect them. And it was a fictional scenario that was created that postulated a disease outbreak of unknown origins in the city. And the public went in and they had a variety of experiences that people rotated around, where they got to look at some cells under microscopes, and they did some mathematical modeling activities that would look about how they were going to address this outbreak that was taking place. So they were given a narrative story, and then they got to take part in the decision making about how they would manage this outbreak, this seeming pandemic that was occurring at the time, which now seems very, very relevant. But at the time, it was really, really exciting because of the format and the way that the public came in, and they were really, really excited about the zombies that were involved, and the actors and actresses, and they were also really interested in the science and how those overlapped, and it really put them at the center of making the decisions in a fun and engaging way. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about citizen science. This is Slugwatch. Slugwatch was a program that was set up at the John Innes Center. In about 2012, there was a new species of slug that was identified that was really much more of a problem for crops and for gardeners because it reproduced much faster. It seemed to eat a much wider variety of plants, crops, and so there's a real worry about this spreading. It was originally thought to come from Spain. It has been seen in other parts of Europe, but we really needed to get a better idea of how widespread this was. So we set up a citizen science project that would inform people about slugs and give people information about them, and also let them explore them in their gardens or their local area, and then report back what they found to us. A great way of collecting data and getting people interested and excited about a topic like slugs, and I was quite surprised at how interested people are actually in slugs. Also at the John Innes Center, we did another citizen science approach, and citizen science basically falls into two main categories. There are those which involve environmental observations, like Slugwatch, and where people will collect data. And then there are approaches that involve processing or analyzing data. And Fraxinus is a really good example of this. Infection of trees, ash dieback disease, which is caused by a fungus Clara fraxinae, was found in the UK. And what they wanted to do, the scientists, is they wanted to be able to look at the DNA and look at large amounts of DNA and speed up the process where they could find useful DNA for resistance to this disease to enable them to breed trees that would be resistant to the disease. And so they took the genetic data that they had, and they turned it into a color sorting matching game, and then they put it on Facebook to enable people to play the game and at the same time generate data that would help the scientists with their genetic research. So a really good way to get people involved and make it fun. One of my favorite examples of really involving people in research is the Black Autumn Bees paper. And this is actually a research project that started at the beginning, involved from the very outset collaborative research between researchers, and in this case, it was elementary school students. So young students came up with the research questions, and they came up with the methods and the procedure they were going to use to carry out their research. And they were looking at what colors would attract bees and what lights and how they would interact with different colors. And this all was facilitated by a neuroscience researcher, Bo Lotto. And it's just amazing that he was able to get an elementary school to actually collect the data, and then he took them all the way through the process until they got their work published. And they were actually able to be published authors while they're still in their primary school. In Canada, we have projects like the Great Lakes Protection Initiative. This is run by Environment and Climate Change Canada to increase Canadians' knowledge of and engagement in water quality and ecosystem health issues in the Great Lakes. It involves participation for Indigenous communities and organizations and citizen science. So there's funding for both of those areas. They wanted to enable there to be projects that Indigenous people at the community level could be involved in, where they were creating networks to share information and generate knowledge. And also a way for people to engage in citizen science for this program. The Government of Canada actually has a citizen science portal, and there's a whole variety. I've collected some of the sort of citizen science projects on here. Things like Ice Watch and looking at Arctic plants and weather and those sort of things. So if collecting data is something that is important, it's certainly amenable, I think, in the permafrost field to find ways to set up some sort of citizen science project where people can share their observations, temperature measurements, and those sort of things. In fact, in 2018, Kirsty Duncan, who's the Minister of Science and Sport, she actually took part in a Google Hangout for her involvement with this citizen science. This was organized by Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, which is run by Jesse Hildebrand. And it was looking at Frog Watch, which was a citizen science project to look at frogs in Ontario. There's ones that are run by social enterprises. So Smart Ice, I mentioned Smart Ice in the Science Communication 101 workshop, and there are projects that carry out community engagement. They involve the community in their work, and they provide the equipment and the tools for carrying out ice measurements, recording sea ice thickness, and they really involve the community in collecting this data, going out to collect the data, having employability, as well as providing the knowledge and the information for this, as well as the equipment and the tools. So it's a really, really good program for engaging with Inuit communities, combining their traditional and local knowledge with some of the other resources that they might need to be able to look at their environment and then share that information amongst themselves and, of course, with researchers. And they have databases for collecting that data and managing that. Now, I mentioned earlier that the health research field is one of the areas where there's usually the most in-depth and carefully structured forms of public engagement. Participatory research is mainly the medical and social health fields. You saw the example of the black autumn bees. It can be done in other fields where you have collaboration, but really the medical and social health fields are where you get the most real significant participatory research undertaken. And it could be because there's involvement in clinical studies. You need to be held to a higher standard if you want to protect people's health and well-being, which is why these tend to be much more robust. And in November 2019, there was a report was produced that was a project between the Chiefs of Ontario and clinical academic partners. And this came out of the 2015 report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And what it was looking at was, in this case specifically, diabetes within First Nations communities and getting the experiences of First Nations who have diabetes, what it's like, and incorporating that into the knowledge base and into the understanding of that so that it's much more beneficial overall, the impact of the research being conducted, and also ensuring that the data, that the sovereignty of the data for those First Nations who are involved in this. And rather than just being seen as users of the end research, that they're really integrated and incorporated into the whole process. So it's a really, really important approach. In the last little section, I'm going to very quickly go over some forms of online public engagement. You may be familiar with Reddit AMAs. Ask Me Anything is what AMA stands for. This is an example of a group who are talking about their research in Tuktoyak, looking at coastal erosion. And as you can see, it's a long-form sort of engagement to provide information up front. So it has similarities to a consensus conference by informing people in advance. And then there's usually a set time. And at that set time, the researchers will be available to have discussions and have a conversation. And people will be able to post questions and get responses. It can be a really, really good way to reach the general public. School children, sometimes you'll have young people going on there. Their teachers may set them tasks to go and ask some scientists some questions and report back. And it can also be a very good way for engaging with journalists. Maybe they want to use an opportunity in a forum like this to research a story they're going to write. And this is going to be a good way to inform them and make those connections early on in that process. Similarly to that, you might have Twitter chats, which are also scheduled at a set time. They usually have a set organization who will host them. The Evidence for Democracy Twitter chats, well known because they're an organization that has run a number of them, and they would do them regularly, and they would be able to advertise and promote that they were going to occur. So people can come onto Twitter, they can use a hashtag, they can ask questions, and then the discussion and engagement and debate revolves around that hashtag. So it can be quite dynamic and fun, and of course the cost is very, very low, because if you can collaborate with the right organization, they can manage a lot of that, and you just make yourself available if you've got a Twitter account to be able to answer the questions. There's an Ask a Scientist platform on the Government of Canada's website, so you can submit questions and then there will be responses, and scientists will respond to those. So Chris Dirksen, he has done one recently talking about climate change, and he's got a little video of that. I'd encourage you to go have a look at some point, see his little Ask a Scientist video, and consider, offering to do something like that. You have programs like Skype a Scientist, and Skype a Scientist involves video chats. So it uses the Skype platform, and as you can see here from this picture, the usual format tends to be a classroom of young people who are able to hear a scientist and see them, talk to them, and ask them questions. It's similar in some ways. You may sometimes see maybe school children who've been able to talk to NASA astronauts who are on the International Space Station. So it's got a similar sort of format. It's a very, very good way for having that conversation and sharing information and getting a feel for what it's like for life as a scientist or as an astronaut. Another program that's similar is I'm a Scientist, Get Me Out of Here. It's a conversation normally held between scientists and school students. In this case, though, there's two main forums. One is the Ask a Scientist forum, where it's very much like the one that you saw with Chris, that's on the Government of Canada site, where students at any time can submit their questions and scientists will respond with their answers. There's also the live chats, and these live chats will be really the most dynamic part of the activity. There will be 5 scientists and an entire class of students who would all be asking and talking at the same time in chat windows. So the students would all be able to type their questions and their comments, and the scientists could all answer them at the same time. So it added a lot of energy. It was a very, very exciting event. But they're another way that you can, maybe with less pressure than just being on your own, talk to a group of students. Knowing that you've got other scientists there to talk with can take some of that pressure off and make it feel a little easier if this is something new. The organization I'm a Scientist, Get Me Out of It also produce debate kits, and they work with scientists to be able to create tools that teachers can use or informal science educators can use to have discussions around controversial issues and topics. I mentioned already exploring by your seat of your pants, which has similarities to Skype as scientists, and this provides a means for people to get out in the field and actually, maybe rather than just talking from their office or their lab in a building, to be able to actually go out and show people what life is like when they're doing their research out in the field. This section is about your public engagement. What I'd like you to think about is choosing your public engagement approach. That could be getting public views and opinions. You might want to look at some sort of public attitude survey. You may just want to have an informal conversation. You might want to gain public trust. That might be important to the community you're working with, that they understand the work you're doing and why you're doing it, and trust the research you're doing. And you might want to let the public actually take part in your research, help out, collaborate, collect data, analyze some of the data. You might want to let them choose the direction, give you advice, say, this is what we think needs to be researched. You've got a great idea, but we've got something that we think would be really good. Might be worth listening to them. And then you might want to actually look at the policy side of things. What are the implications of your research and how will that maybe affect policy? And that might, in the permafrost field, be specifically about policy on things like road building or standards for building property in buildings, houses, in areas that are prone to permafrost thaw. So I've got a few little tips I'll quickly give you just before we go into our breakout rooms. First of all, plan on engaging the public early in the research process. Try and get the budget. Make sure that you have the money to do it. Might mean applying for grants. And if you can, hire or work with professionals to support you, because it can really make a big difference. Next is your turn. I don't know if everyone's going to stay around for 30 minutes, but we'll provide you that time to have these little chats. So the first one, I'd like you to have a little think. So going into breakout rooms to think of what would be your goal for any public engagement activity, and who would that audience be? Would it be some school students in a school in Alberta, or might it be an Indigenous organization in the north of Canada?
We were breakout room 1. I think I took us in the wrong direction. I didn't so much talk about goal, but rather talk about audience. And we were specifically talking about northern communities and how we would approach outreach or public education differently between like the general age group compared to the younger groups, and kind of, I wouldn't say concluded, but lean towards having 2 different events, one for like the general public of all ages, and then one like specifically for school age kids, by like going to the schools and chatting with them and getting their views and opinions and thoughts.
Fantastic. Well, certainly if you come along to the community engagement workshop, that's going to go into that sort of approach with those sort of audiences in much more depth. Today is very much a broad overview, but it's great that you're thinking about those different sort of audiences within audiences, that subset in a community. So it's great to start thinking about that at this point.
We were kind of talking about what we've done in the past a little bit and our experiences so far, and the 3 of us, none of us have really had too much experience, particularly with northern communities. So we were talking about, well, how do we kind of go about that, and the difficulties with it during COVID. And I was saying that in the past, we've been told to go to the northern communities and, express our research and what we're finding, what we're doing. But now it's, don't go to these communities, keep them safe, don't go near them. And so it's, very different. It's happened very quickly, this changing perspective. And so now it's kind of, well, how do we now communicate that online? How do we contact the people, and who do we contact? And yeah, like how is this changed now? How is it set up online to be different? And I think that's something we need to know, is how do we deal with this during a pandemic? Because the way it's looking, we still might not be able to go out. Many of us do research over the summer, and so how do we go about that if it's going to be another year without being able to go to communities? That's just something we were thinking about, a different perspective on it. Even while I'm here in Inuvik, it's very difficult because nobody's meeting. Everybody's staying away from each other still.
It's a really good point, and I think this is where those mediating or facilitating organizations can really help. If we can find the right organizations who have the contacts with the communities, and then organize something on a platform where people don't have to meet in person, something like Skype a Scientist might work really nicely. And we can look into that. That's what I'm kind of here to help with.
I have a point that me and Tabitha and Adam were talking about, and it's not necessarily related to the format, but it's more just kind of like a discussion question. And it's basically like, sometimes you want to try all these new formats, but a lot of times the way outreach is done is often through volunteer positions, or through just help, like people helping out here and there. That's how a lot of science communication and outreach is done, at least in my experience. And sometimes it takes quite a lot of effort to try something in a new format. And that's definitely a hurdle that I'm noticing that I am having to overcome, is sometimes you'll put a lot of work into something and it doesn't even deliver very well in terms of engagement. So that's hard to overcome.
I think that's an excellent point. It's a really, really good point, Jen. And I know that this is an issue, and it definitely impacts a lot of people who put the effort in and do the work, and maybe they don't see the return in terms of, say, career progression or appreciation from their supervisors or their organization and their institute. And there's definitely a culture change that needs to occur in the UK, the US, Canada, to enable researchers to feel that it's a worthwhile activity to spend time on. And organizations can support that by providing funding and providing experts to support you and people to help you. If you need someone to set up an event, someone who can organize events, if you need some materials to promote and encourage people to come and attend an event, maybe you need help by a designer or some sort of marketing support, then that's really, really important. And that culture change needs to happen, and it can be quite intimidating, and it can be disheartening if you feel like you don't get a lot of return. It's where there's real benefit in partnering with organizations. So let's say we thought about something like the synthetic biology dialogues and activities, the informal science activities that the NSF was supporting through Building with Biology. In many cases, the scientists should come along to the museum, and they would have museum facilitators and educators there who would have set up the activities. They would support them. You have a location where lots of traffic comes in and people come in. So you usually only have to turn up for that short time when you're going to talk with the students and do the activity. You might need a bit of a briefing beforehand on how the activities work, maybe 20 minutes. And that can shorten it down and make it much more effective for a short amount of time, but it's not always possible. And the only other little thing I'd say is that it can be really hard to know what impact you have. And sometimes you might have had one little conversation, say with a young person, and 15 years later, they end up being a geoscientist. They graduate from Calgary and they go into permafrost research because they met this inspiring, permafrost researcher when they were, 8 years old or something. And so it can be really hard to know the impact you have. But it's a really, really good point. And quite often it's female academics we put more time and energy into it, and the equity isn't always there in terms of those career benefits and appreciation for the effort that goes into doing engagement and outreach type of work. So it's a really, really good point, Jen. Has anyone else got anything?
I can talk a bit about what we discussed. We talked about that, at least for permafrost scientists, it's often very important to have the local community as the persons you are engaging with. And we also talked about the fact that it's at the moment very difficult and very restricted, the formats that we could use. And it's important to find out basically which formats, or which, for example, which social media platforms the communities are using, or the community members are using, to find the best way of to reach the most people.
That's a really good point. And it can sometimes be difficult. You might not know where these communities are online. It's much harder. Geographically, you can sometimes locate people quite easily, but online, it's much trickier. You know, some of these groups, Facebook pages, or maybe they're on a totally different platform. They're on Snapchat and you don't use it, so you're not aware of it. It's a really good point. Next little breakout, we have a little think about what are those sort of skills you might need. Think of like a little shopping list almost.
What skills do you need? I think that's like highly dependent on like the audience and the format that you choose. So I guess it depends on like 2 breakouts we had, like for community consultation, or I guess engagement with communities, translators and community organizers varying, versus if you're doing like a online panel discussion or like an in-person panel discussion, like having a facilitator or being a skilled facilitator is very important. So I guess it depends on like the area that you're going, that dictates what kind of skills you would need.
Following on from what Emma was pointing out, that most of the activities in the next 18 months are likely to be online. And we may see that continues on. People get used to being online and continue that. It's hard to predict, or people may just be zoned out with Zoom and be like, I only want to go to in-person. I don't want to be online anymore once the pandemic's over. But it'll make an impact. You might find that facilitators have the same sort of skill sets, and they may facilitate events in person or online. We have some events that we do, and I work with facilitators who normally would be facilitating in-person events, and they're sort of having to shift to being able to facilitate online events and do them slightly differently. But definitely having organizations say like Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, where you've got someone really vibrant and energetic like Jesse Hildebrand, who can, help, ease some of those nerves you might have. Talking to a whole school of children, for example, I mean, that can be, for anyone, even some teachers, that can be nervous. There's 25 young people who are going to ask you a whole bunch of questions and you've no idea what they're going to ask you. When you have someone who's used to that and experienced with that, they can make the process a lot easier. Think about sort of budgeting in some of these things as well. In northern communities, you might need translators. You might need to sort of think in advance. Do I need someone who's going to be able to translate, and how am I going to afford that? And is there going to be funding? Is the university funding it, or is there going to be a non-profit or some other organization who can fund it?
One thing I think also, I don't know if that's necessarily considered a skill, but someone who's kind of like you said, who's done any of these things before, makes the process like way easier. When you're just like out on a limb and everybody's trying something new, it's a lot harder to organize. Whereas like if there's any form of base to work off of, it makes it so much more simple.
Totally true, Jen. In the years that I've been working in public engagement, I've always seen people who do something new and do it on their own find it so much harder. In some cases, they're amazing. They blow you away and they go off and do some amazing thing and set it all up. But a lot of the time, it's hard. And quite often it's because people are maybe not aware of the support that is available out there. They're not aware that there might be people in their organizations who can help with some elements of it. And if you're really lucky, you have an organization that you can sort of join in, you can piggyback in. Sometimes it's difficult because you don't feel like you're involved at the start and maybe you don't hear about their need for expertise. But if you're lucky, if you have something like maybe the Alberta Narratives Project, which has got a huge number of partners and organizations, if you've done some of these things in the past, they might be inviting you along because they're like, wow, Jen's a safe pair of hands. We know she's not going to, talk in full of jargon and ways that people are not going to be able to understand and not be able to be accessible. And they'll start inviting you along. Once you start doing it, it's a bit like being invited to appear on TV interviews or be quoted in the news. Journalists will get used to people and they'll go back to them because they're a reliable source. And it's the same with public engagement and outreach. Those organizers, facilitators who want to do it, they're going to go back to the people. And I know I used to often go back to people because I'm like, I know that they're great. They're great with a class of children. So I'm going to ask them if they can do this activity we have coming up. Hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And I notice it even like volunteering for like a CPA or something. You have to know what each person is kind of good at, but it's hard. Like you have your little circle that you know who you can call on, but if you haven't directly interacted with someone, it's hard to be like, oh yeah, they're really good with like databases, or they're really good with like designing surveys, or they're really good with social media, because you haven't got the opportunity to know them and what they're actually good and reliable at. So I find like a big hurdle for me is like getting to know as many people as possible so that I have like a directory of who I can call on. And if you don't have that big directory, then it's like, then there's not as much you can do.
I totally agree with Jen, like working with Pern and others. There's a lot of like things that we'll want to do, but then it's like, how, like, who has the skills to be able to do this? And like when we first started working together, it was kind of like we were all just like bouncing ideas off each other, but we didn't really know each other yet. So it was hard to determine like, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And then like in the first few months, I would try and like design my own things. And then one day we had like a winter event and someone made like this beautiful poster that was like hand drawn. I'm like, why were you hiding this the whole time? So like knowing who can do what and like who has the capacity to help you is also very important when you're doing these kinds of things. I totally agree with Jen. Last
little sort of question I think to think about is those resources that you might need. You might need a great artist.
I mean, I think this comes back to you talking about how there's needs to be a little bit of a shift in how science values outreach activities, because I don't feel like there's like a ton of resources for it. Like it's usually done on a volunteer basis, and there isn't a lot of funding for example, for scientists to pay an artist to draw a caricature of their work or something. Like it has to come through like you getting to know someone and then you figuring out that they're good at this.
Funding is definitely a challenge, and hopefully in my presentation I was able to demonstrate how that cultural shift in the UK has really come about from the top level. The funders of science embedded it. They made it really important. In America, when the NSF have their broader impacts, they make it something that you can get money to do and that you might be judged on when you're applying for grants. And that's what's needed to bring around big culture changes and enable you to justify it and to be able to say, yes, I'm spending some time, communicating my research or engaging with this community, and it is worthwhile. It's time I can spend, but it does all cost money. Unfortunately, no easy answers for that at this stage, especially at your level when you're starting out in research. It can be much harder.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't think a lot of, like, say you are a young researcher using the grants of your supervisor, depending on the supervisor, they might not have that much money to kind of give as like experiment money, as like what you can do. You can try different like ways to engage. There's usually not that much money for that.
Yeah. One of the things that like I'm kind of struggling with right now is eventually when I get to do field work, I'm going to do field work in a community where there's been like no Laurentian researchers or really any research up there at all. So like I'm going to be working out of Fort Severn, and I know they don't have a good relationship with the Ministry of Natural Resources or the Ministry of the Environment. And I was talking to a community from like community, and he said like the community that I'll be going to is kind of like how his community years ago when they hadn't been exposed to it yet. But basically, like the long point that I'm trying to get at is I'm the only person like trying to go up there right now, and I think that makes it very difficult because like I think I'm severely lacking resources or even just people power to be able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is something that makes it difficult.
Connections, people. It's all about people.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's about people, and there's no easy answers to that. But if you can somehow find those connections to start the conversation, you can't even have a conversation until you find the people and the right people to talk about, so that it starts off well, starting off on the right foot. And it's not always easy, but it can help to start early and to get the conversation going, or to reach out to some people, at least at the beginning. Thank you very much for staying with me. And hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully it's been a good session, been useful. If you have any questions, you can always contact me on Teams. I'm happy for you to drop me a chat message, or you can email me. We'll be providing the slides up there eventually in the recording of the session. And I look forward to chatting about science communication, public engagement in the future.
Thanks, Tristan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Tristan.
you.
Nice to meet everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.